Hey everyone, it's Heather Nichols, and today I have a card to share that's created with the Modern Mosaic Layered Stencil set, and I used it with liquid watercolors. I'm going to jump right into my project today. I'm using the 118-pound watercolor cardstock from the Tailored Expression store. This has a rough side and a smooth side. I'll be using the smooth side for my project. I'm using a little adhesive to attach my watercolor cardstock to a grid paper sheet to hold it in place while I do the stenciling over the top. The Modern Mosaic Layered Stencil set has 3 stencils, and you can tell which side is the right side up by the etching in the lower left-hand corner, and there's also a numbering system in the lower right-hand corner so you can see what order the stencils are meant to be used in. I'll be using Pixie spray to hold the stencils in place on my project. Instead of using blender brushes to apply color through my stencils, I'll be using liquid watercolor. I have a water brush and some water, and I have a palette that I've dripped several drops of lime zest, blue raspberry, and guava watercolor into. I'll take my water brush and get it wet in the water. I'll pick up some liquid watercolor onto my brush, and I'll paint it into the openings on the stencil. Because I'm using watercolor, there's going to be a somewhat imperfect look to the design, which is what I'm going for. And your colors are going to bleed a little bit, and they're going to run into each other a little bit. I don't want things getting too muddy though, so when I am painting the color into the spaces, I have things wet, but not like sopping wet. I'm doing this first stencil with lime zest liquid watercolor, and then when I'm finished with that, I'm going to let it dry pretty completely. You can let this air dry, or I used a heat tool to speed along the process. Once my first layer was dry, I took my next stencil, and I'm going to do this one with blue raspberry liquid watercolor. This layered stencil set does have alignment guides that you can add color into for lining things up. I didn't paint into the alignment guides to use those for this project. This particular design is really easy to line up right over the top of the layer underneath. I'm using my brush again to pick up that blue raspberry liquid watercolor and apply it through the openings on the stencil. Again, I'm making sure that things are not too extra wet so that I can avoid any extra bleeding and running of the paint colors. Once I've applied the color through the whole stencil, I'll let this dry completely. I used a heat tool again to speed along the process. When that second layer of color is dry, I'll layer that third stencil on top. Again, this is very easy to line up right over the top of the stencil design, and then I will use Guava liquid watercolor to apply through the stencil openings with my brush. When I'm all finished applying the color, I'll remove the stencil so that I can see the completed pattern. I love the flowy and imperfect look that the liquid watercolors give to this stencil design. I added a few splatters to my completed design. I picked up blue raspberry liquid watercolor on my brush and then tapped the brush over my finger to splatter my project. I'm using the largest die from the Stitched Rectangle Stacklets die collection to cut out this design for the background on my card. I'll line up the die where I want it, and I'll hold that in place with some Scotch removable tape and send it through my die cut machine. Now I'm going to do the sentiment for my card. I have a strip here that is embossed with a sentiment from the Simple Strips Thanks stamp. I have it embossed in white on watercolor cardstock, and it's cut out with the Simple Strips die. And then I'm going to just paint that strip with blue raspberry liquid watercolor so that it coordinates perfectly with my background. Wherever the embossing is, it will resist that liquid watercolor that I'm applying to the strip. I'll attach my background to a Toffee card base, and then we'll get the rest of this card put together. I'm using letters that I cut out with the Cap It Off Alpha dies to spell out the word hey, and I have them layered so that I have the outside outline up just a little bit higher than the inside outline, and that was just done by adding a few more layers onto that outside outline than just having a single layer on the inside. Before I die cut the layers, I put stick it on the back of the Toffee cardstock that I cut them out from, so to attach them to the card front will be really easy. I just have to peel that paper backing off. I'm using a ruler to make sure the letters are lined up straight on the card. I'm using a foam sticky strip to pop up that sentiment strip that I watercolored right underneath the word hey, and that completes the sentiment for my card, which is hey, girl, you are amazing. And then for my final finishing touch on this card are a few of the Bits and Pieces clear drip drops. I did a few on each side of the hey word, and I used the multi-medium mat to adhere those into place. This card is done, and I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned something new today. Maybe you'll give using liquid watercolors with your stencils a try. You can find stencils, liquid watercolors, and the other supplies that I used to create this project in the Tailored Expressions web store at tailoredexpressions.com. Thanks so much for joining me today, everybody, and I'll see you next time.